Today is February 13th, which means that it is Galentine's Day, and what better way to celebrate ladies than to talk about the American women's suffrage movement? What? So let's crack open our favorite $8 bottle of wine and get this party started. Lady style. I wrote my notes about this today while I was at work, so if it's a little bit discombobulated. Also, this is the 5th time that I've started this, and I've had quite a bit of wine already. That is why. Alright, so we're talking about American history. We have to go back a little bit further than, like, the 19-teens to talk about this. And to go back a little bit further than we might in American history, Native Americans were matrilineal, which means that women were participating in making their own decisions far before the European settlers came in and were like, what's going on here? But in terms of pre-revolutionary America, a Massachusetts widow named Lydia Taft was voting in town meetings prior to the Revolution. There are no other documented cases of women participating in such a way prior to the Revolution. But after the Revolution, the state of New Jersey allowed women to vote in a special provision. Unfortunately, that provision, like they explicitly said it, unfortunately that provision was rolled back in 1807. Wealthy women didn't really have a whole lot to gain from suffrage, so that's why they didn't necessarily support it or think about it. Much like Abigail Adams, they just expected their husbands to express their needs. So wealthy women didn't really have a whole lot to gain. Until about the 1840s, people started speaking out about it. Two Boston women named Lucretia Mott and Margaret Fuller began to speak about the inequity of the sexes, and by 1846, the National Liberty Party nominated Gerrit Smith as their nominee for president. And in his convention speech, Smith equated denying women the right to vote with being a barbaric society. It should be noted that Smith was actually Elizabeth Cady Stanton's first cousin. Fun fact. A couple of years later, with the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments was written by Stanton, and it was kind of mirroring Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, one of the course of human events, blah, 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 blah. It was a very powerful piece of rhetoric, and it was used to assert the rights of women in their own sphere, in their homes. By 1850, this movement has started to crystallize, and Lucy Stone put on a convention with a couple maybe a dozen other people, called the National Women's Rights Convention. It united women who had previously been splintered off in their own separate areas, maybe by geographic borders, maybe by class borders. Though this movement was still primarily by wealthier women, it asserted that women should have the choice of their sphere, whether they wanted to be at home with their families in traditional roles, or moving forward in more business and political roles. And it was actually at this convention, in Lucy Stone's closing speech, that Susan B. Anthony was called to action. Susan B. Anthony was part of the temperance movement, and she was frustrated with the lack of women in that movement, or the lack of women leadership in that movement. And by 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. They were a radical organization that wanted a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. They were very much anti the 15th Amendment because they didn't see that this amendment, which granted African-American men the right to vote, as enough. Because it wasn't including women. It just simply wasn't enough. On the other hand, Lucy Stone earlier had formed the New England Women's Suffragists Association, which was a pro-Republican organization. It was pro the 15th Amendment, and it saw the 15th Amendment as a stepping stone to getting women the vote, even though the Republicans at the time were very much more in favor of granting African-American men the right to vote over women. It was a much more moderate organization, and by 1890 these two groups had merged together to form one cause. And they kind of moved forward throughout the very tail end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And by World War I, they were really called to action when Woodrow Wilson declared World War I the War of Democracy. And the women were pissed because they couldn't vote. They were not part of democracy. And the Wilson administration actually ignored the women protesters on Pennsylvania Avenue for 6 months. And it just wasn't a good deal for the suffragettes. On the whole, though, the Western states were a little bit more not a little bit more, they were very much more giving women the right to vote in a non-traditional way, because the Western states didn't expect women to hold traditional gender roles, because the roles of the Western world were different than that of the Eastern world. And in fact, in 1869, Wyoming became the first state to unilaterally grant women the right to vote as a territory, and in 1890 refused to be admitted as a state unless women were granted the right to vote in their state. And one thing that's not really touched upon by very many scholars or historians is the women of color participating in suffragette movements. But in Illinois in particular, African American women were very, very ardent suffragettes because they felt that this would help them end exploitation, both sexually and otherwise, of women, increase access to education, and helping women who were already in the workplace, in the workforce. And as today, these women were dealing with the double whammy of sexism and racism, and they were very, very much pushing for these ideals. By 1919, multiple bills and multiple pieces of legislation have been pushed into the House and Senate, multiple hearings from 1869 forward of these women's organizations trying to get the right to vote. And by 1919, Wilson had implored both the House and Senate leaders to get this thing to pass. And finally, on May 21st, 1919, some 70 years after Lucretia Mott was first speaking about the inequity of the sexes, these bills passed in the Congress and were moved to the states for ratification. 3/4 of the states ratified, and women were granted the right to vote for the first time in federal elections in 1920. It is interesting to note, and it should be noted, that not all states ratified at the same time. Mississippi's state legislature didn't ratify the 19th Amendment until 1984. And to this day, women are not represented equally in Congress. Only 97 of 535 members of the House and Senate are women. 20 members of the Senate and 77 members in the House. So this is the point where I implore you to please register to vote. You can go to registertovote.org or contact your state Secretary of State office to register to vote. It's extremely important. The suffragettes fought very hard and for a very long time, and now people are not voting, especially young people, and it's very disheartening. And so I'm going to close today by reading to you a passage from the Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony reader, which was their correspondence, their speeches, their writings. It's the very last entry in this book, and it was written sometime before October 26, 1902. My dear Mrs. Stanton, we little dreamed when we began this contest, optimistic with the hope and buoyancy of youth, that a half-century later we would be compelled to leave the finish of the battle to another generation of women. But our hearts are filled with joy to know that they enter upon this task equipped with a college education, with business experience, and with the fully admitted right to speak in public, all of which were denied to women 50 years ago. They have practically but one point to gain, the suffrage. We had all. These strong, courageous, capable women will take our place and complete our work. There is an army of them where we were but a handful. Ancient prejudice has become so softened, public sentiment so liberalized, and women so thoroughly demonstrated their ability as to leave not a shadow of doubt that they will carry our cause to victory. And we, dear old friend, shall move on to the next sphere of existence, higher and larger, we cannot fail to believe, and one where women will not be placed in an inferior position, but will be welcomed on a plane of perfect intellectual and spiritual equality. Ever lovingly yours, Susan B. Anthony. Maybe I can end this. So that is a brief history of the suffrage movement in the United States. Have a good night and happy Galentine's Day.